Hi, everybody. In this session, we're going to talk all about persuasion and the role of professional communication in our persuasive attempts. So we're going to organize this first by taking a look at what exactly persuasion is and is not, and then talk about some tactics, best practices, and some tips that we can use to try to be a little bit more persuasive in everyday life, particularly in those professional settings. So I want to start by just going over something that I've seen over the years. So I've done a lot of workshops and worked with, thousands of people. And I've often asked them this question, how do you define communication? And we'll go around the room and folks will write down their own answers. And one of the things that's always so compelling to me is that you usually see that there are two different responses. There are folks who write down that communication is a process and an exchange of messages between two people. They might even include something like listening. There's a second group of people, though, that will often answer the question something along the lines of communication is the successful exchange of information, or communication is when one party understands the other party. And I always make a point to try to identify that those are different definitions, that once we imply that there has been some sort of success, that the outcome of the communication has been what we wanted it to be, that we're actually pushing further on a definition of communication into something that looks a lot more like persuasion, right? So when we look at this process of communication, and this is one that you're relatively familiar with, right? You have a source and a receiver, and you've got the channel in the middle, you have messages being encoded and decoding, and you have this feedback loop. When we look at this, this is the process of communication. And a definition of communication for this particular process says nothing about relative success. It says nothing about understanding. But that brings us to persuasion, right? Because when we define or think about the concept of persuasion, what makes it unique from a definition of communication is that it implies something. So when I use the term or the concept that I persuaded my audience, you can infer that something happened. You can infer that I had a goal, that I had a mission, and that I was successful in that mission, that I wanted my audience to do or to think or to feel something, and I was successful in doing that. I persuaded them. It has this very positive bias to us. It also implies some other things. It also implies that when I go to persuade, that I know what I'm trying to accomplish. It also assumes that my audience, to some degree, when it comes to persuasion, is also aware of my attempt, that they know that this is taking place and that they are in some ways willingly, right, agreeing to or adopting whatever it is that my message or concepts or belief are. Okay, just as an aside, if the audience doesn't have choice, then now they've lost what we talk about as being free will or conscious awareness. And that's no longer persuasion, right? That's coercion. If I coerce somebody to do something, I'm not giving them any choice. I'm essentially making them do it. And that's not what persuasion is either. So in a professional setting, persuasion is really important because if you think about it, right, for the majority of your professional career, and likely for your personal careers as well, like you're trying to get the people around you to do the things that you want them to do. You're trying to motivate your clients or your customers to work with you. You're trying to motivate your peers and your colleagues to have you on your team. You're trying to motivate your supervisors to give you that promotion. You're probably trying to motivate the people in your personal life to want to spend time with you or to help support you in the ways that you need. Now, persuasion oftentimes kind of carries a relatively negative connotation, right? So if I said I persuaded them, right, sometimes maybe we associate it with like, something that's negative. It's a manipulation. But again, persuasion allows the audience to have choice. So one of the things that we want to focus on is how do we use all of these professional communication skills that we've been working on and building to try to achieve the outcomes that we're most interested in, right? So when we think about persuasion, and as we go into this, I want us to start at the forefront of making one key assertion or assumption, and that is that if I'm going to persuade, that I have a goal, I have an outcome in mind, I'm trying to accomplish something, and that as I go through the persuasive process, I'll be able to evaluate whether or not I've been successful because I've marked in advance, I've hypothesized and predicted what I want to happen, and whether or not that happens can determine whether or not my persuasive attempts were ultimately successful. So I want to talk a little bit about a theory here to help ground and to really make sense of your next persuasive attempt. So through your professional communication, you're constantly going to be dealing with a wide range of audiences who have a lot of different opinions on a lot of different things. And so you might be wondering to yourself, like, how can I quickly and easily make some key kind of assertions about my audience that will help me determine how I should try to communicate with them that will theoretically lead to greater success? So I introduced to you the elaboration likelihood model. It's a relatively simple model that essentially puts forth the idea that humans are going to process information, and they're going to process information in one of two ways. They're either going to process it via the central route, which means they have a high degree of involvement in the message. They really care. They're invested in it. They know a lot about it, or it has a tremendous impact on their life and the way that they're working or living or thinking. Or on the other side, humans are going to process information via a peripheral route, right? It's more peripheral, meaning that it's going to really probably impact them more in an emotional manner. It's going to impact the way that they maybe feel. It's not a message or piece of content that is directly important to them. It's not something that is going to necessarily at this given time change their lives. And so if you think about it, right, if you're, for example, driving down the highway and there's all sorts of different billboards, right? There are billboards for things that you have no idea what they're about, right? Things that you don't need or want or have never thought about. And so as you pass those billboards, you're processing them peripherally. Maybe you're looking at who the spokesperson is, or you're looking at the colors, the font, or does it have a pretty picture or a landscape, right? And if any of those things appeal to you, you might be more likely to remember the message for a relatively short amount of time. But if you passed a billboard that was advertising something that you were actually looking for, maybe you were actually driving to the location that was being advertised in the billboard, suddenly, right, that appeal is going to be processed in a more central manner. Maybe you're actually going to remember the exit number. Maybe you're going to remember some of the appeals that they were making in their messaging. And so you can actually do a lot with this simple, basic approach in terms of how you go about persuading folks on a daily basis. And what I mean by this ultimately is that I would love for you to kind of use your professional communication skills in all settings, right? Whether you're networking or interviewing or just on a daily basis working with your colleagues, go through this process of asking yourself, how much involvement does my audience have with the given message that I'm sending? Now, involvement becomes the key factor for determining in the ELM whether folks are going to process your message in a central manner or in a peripheral manner. So high level of involvement, meaning they've thought a lot about it, they know a lot about it, they care a lot about it, it's something that's really important to them, they're going to go through the central route. And one of the things that we know about central route processing is that, one, it's going to be met with a lot more counter arguments and things that are important to me that I know a lot about, that I think a lot about. If you give me a message on it, I'm going to really scrutinize that message. And on the surface, that doesn't seem like a good thing, but it actually is, because if I'm processing a message via the central route that you've sent to me, and I'm really scrutinizing and I'm thinking about it a whole lot, I'm actually listening to the message and I'm actually analyzing what it is that you have to say. Now, certainly it means that your persuasive attempts, that your message and your content really needs to be of high quality. It needs to focus on logical appeals. It needs to be well supported and have great evidence, et cetera. But the other thing that we know from the literature is that if you're successful in persuading or changing the attitudes or the behaviors of your audience, it's more likely that those changes will last for a longer period of time. And it makes sense, right? I put a lot of thought and effort into agreeing, let's say, with your attitudes or your beliefs. And so once I actually go through that process, I'm going to onboard them and keep them with me. Now, I'm going to tell you this, the vast majority of people that you interact with on a daily basis throughout the course of your life, they likely do not have anywhere near the level of involvement in your messages that you do. In fact, I would, sometimes encourage the audiences and the folks that I work with to kind of approach most people with a lower level of involvement on their content, right? Because in my mind right now, there are all sorts of things in my life that are really important to me that I'm thinking and concentrating and worrying about. And you don't really relatively know what any of those things are. So when you approach me with your message that is focused on the things that you're worried and interested in about, they're probably not the same as me. So if you go through the majority of your interactions in a professional setting, assuming on the very forefront that chances are folks are going to process your message in a peripheral manner, you can now start to make appeals to folks who have lower levels of motivation on your message. And what does that look like? Okay, so we're talking about appeals that are based on, emotions. Think about humor, think about aesthetics, right? So how something looks, how something smells, how something tastes, how something feels, right? Those things that are appealing to us outside of our cognitions, but just our senses and our emotions. Now, one of the things that we do know, right, is that if you're making a peripheral route appeal, that chances are the lasting impact of that appeal will be relatively short, but that's okay, right? Because maybe one of your only primary goals is just to get folks' attention, right? Maybe one of your primary goals is just to make them feel, is just to make them recognize that you're there, that your message exists. And that once you've done that over time, there is the possibility that you can try and sometimes be successful of moving somebody from the peripheral to the central route. And that can be really important. So the takeaway here is is my audience really invested in this message, in this piece of content or not, right? And if you think about things that we're really invested in, those are not things that are commonly as often shared. But when they are, it also tells you that if you have a really important message, if you're sending out a professional email and it's about somebody's, benefits at work, it's about their salary, it's about their employment status. If it's something that impacts, right, their livelihood, they're going to process that centrally, which means we don't need to have a lot of frills on that message. It doesn't need to have a lot of, amazing fonts and be really well laid out and designed, because I'm going to read it. It's really important to me. I'm going to process this message. I'm going to scrutinize it. But if it's something that's much more peripheral, that's when we want to introduce those aesthetic cues. Now, you may be wondering, how could I potentially move somebody from peripheral to central over time? And so you kind of have to ask yourself, like, well, what other factors are likely influencing message processing? And like, how could you change or alter somebody's motivation? And so we'll keep this one really simple, but the two kind of constraints that we really have oftentimes is time and resources, right? Or sometimes ability. So one of the things that we've seen in marketing campaigns, and we've seen this done from, home shopping on television to sometimes sales in stores, is you can manipulate how much time you're going to give the audience to make a decision, right? So you can either give them a lot of time, or you can give them a little amount of time, or you can tell them that there's a lot of quantity, that there's a huge bandwidth for this, or that there's very limited bandwidth and it's exclusive. And what you're getting at here is that by manipulating how much time that they have to make a decision, or how many are available for them to make a decision, one of the things that you're doing is you're putting them into a position where now they really have to scrutinize the message more carefully. Now they really have to think about, is this a decision that I want to make right now? Now, sometimes that won't work, but sometimes it does. And a great example of this that I often pull from is the QVC, or Home Shopping Network, right? Many years ago, one of the things that they added as a feature to the on-screen experience was that they would actually put a counter up, right? And they would show you how much time was left to order this product. They would sometimes even then add how many quantities they had left, right? And as the time ticked down, so did the quantity. So if you were approaching this in a very peripheral manner, and you were just kind of watching the TV in the background, and it just got your attention because you saw the scissors cut the penny in half, or whatever the product could do that was so amazing, now all of a sudden they've manipulated the resources, they manipulated the time, and they've put you in a position where they're saying, you're going to need to think about this a little bit more critically, because you're going to run out of time, you're going to run out of resources. And so we've seen this done with sales, right? This is why sales exist. This is why sales don't exist all the time. They exist in a short amount of time to kind of get to push you into that central route. So you're making that decision to, in some cases, buy certain things. So identify the involvement of your audience, and then think about, how you want to potentially manipulate how much time that they have available to make. Now, as we looked around off this session, right, one of the things that often comes up when we talk about persuasion is the credibility of the source, right? So you as a message sender, you as a professional communicator, right? What is your credibility? So it's so important that we first and foremost recognize that credibility is bestowed upon us by the audience. That credibility of our person does not exist within us. And to prove that point, right, there are so many folks throughout the world that we could start to list. And I could ask you simply, do you think that this person is credible? And as we went through various audiences, some people would say, yes, this person is so credible. And other people would say, oh my God, are you serious? Like, that person has no credibility to me. Aha. So the way that we perceive credibility depends on our life experiences and depends on things that we value. So what you need to recognize as a persuader, as somebody who's trying to use your professional communication skills in a persuasive manner, is, does my audience think I'm credible? And some will and some will not, right? And you have to have that empathy and that perspective exchange to know, when am I credible and when am I not? And in the moments where you're credible, right, you can certainly lean on your credibility. But here's where it gets really interesting, right? So the research on the elaboration likelihood model, the dual process model that we just talked about, central and peripheral route, one of the things that we find is that credibility is actually a feature and a factor in the peripheral route. Now think about this for a second, right? Credibility is more important to folks with lower levels of involvement than folks with higher levels of involvement. And it kind of makes sense once you think about it, right? So when you go into a scenario or setting where you don't have a lot of professional experience, right? You don't know a lot about the topic, and then you're going to rely on that person, right? Whoever that source is of that message, and they're going to be the person to try to guide you through it. And the good example of this is, think about going to your doctor, right? Think about going to somebody who has a real specialty in an area, right? You may not be able to read an MRI or an X-ray, right? You may not be able to really kind of make sense of lab or blood tests and results like that. So you're relying on the credibility of your doctor. Now, here's what happens. Sometimes you will take your doctor's advice and you'll follow it, right? And you're following it based on their credibility, based on what they're telling you. And other times you don't. And in the times whether you do or you don't, if we look on our slide here for a moment, what is credibility made up with? Trustworthiness, expertise, and goodwill. And to have credibility, you need to have those three things, right? So expertise, right? Those degrees and those certifications and that education and those years of experience, that's where your expertise comes from. That tends to be a little bit more tangible, right? That's something that we can measure, we can look at and see. Trustworthiness, right, is this idea of like, is this person giving me advice that I actually, would utilize, right? Do I believe them? Do I trust them? Do I think that they are giving me this advice from a perspective that they would do it themselves? And finally, goodwill, this idea that I'm trying to help you and I'm not gaining any specific benefit out of this. And that can be a really tricky one, because usually in most professional settings, like me getting you to do something is usually good for me too. So can you demonstrate goodwill to your customers and your clients, right? Those people that you're working with, your peers and your colleagues, like, can you get them to do the things that you want them to do because they think you're giving them that advice because you would do it as well? So when you're kind of thinking about your own credibility, right, it's from the perspective of your audience. And so as you're going through a persuasive attempt, as you're living out your life, you should be constantly evaluating audiences, not just for all the characteristics that they have and not just for whether they have high or low levels of involvement, but do they think that you're credible, right? So somebody who's older than you or younger than you, more or less experienced from the same or different cultures, their assessments of your credibility are going to be, right, totally different. And so whether or not your message is influential, right, may depend on whether or not your credibility is an important part of their message. If involvement is high, your credibility is not as important. The message content becomes very critical. If the person's involvement is relatively low, then suddenly we're going to put a lot of weight on your credibility. So these are things that I want you to be thinking about, questions that you should be asking yourself, right? What does the audience see? What do they feel? What is it that they're looking for? And so go through this relative process, go through these questions anytime that you're making a persuasive attempt. And so this should, over time, as you develop your professional communication skills, ideally, this becomes a second nature and you're going through this process on a rather consistent basis. If you're trying to improve your credibility, there's a few things that you can do. Try to adapt your style to your audience's style. So especially when we're in different cultures or in different areas and parts of the world, like doing the best we can to try to fit in, right? To try to kind of be a part of their culture. That will help with your credibility. Emphasizing similarity and creating empathy is part of that. The other thing that you can do, right, is if you have low credibility, we want to emphasize receiver involvement. So one of the things that you might do is make appeals to try to persuade them that their involvement should be higher. And we see this all the time, right? When we think about, buying protection plans, we think about buying insurances, whether it's for ourselves or for products, for our homes, for our cars, right? A lot of times the pitch is something that's like, you don't think about it until you need it, right? And so they're trying to get you to think about it. And a lot of times, and I just went through this process as I was negotiating for my home and my car insurance, right? They were trying to sell me on this premise of, you need this, right? You're not thinking of it right now, but think about all these catastrophic things that could happen to you. So they were trying to increase my involvement because, that was something that they wanted me to do. And then finally, right, associate yourself with other credible people according to your audience. So if you know that your audience thinks one person is particularly credible, try to be around that person. Try to have an associative link to that various source. Finally, you might be thinking a little bit about personal characteristics in terms of your persuasion. You want to have balance between your dynamism and your sociableness. So in other words, right, you want to be dynamic and engaging, and you want to be able to pull people in because of your style, because the presentation that you're giving is unique and it's really attracting folks from just its overall kind of powerful and energetic nature. At the same time, one of the things that we know from the literature is that you also need to be approachable, right? You need to be relatively likable in a professional setting for folks to want to do work with you over time, for them to want to continue those professional relationships. So finding balance, right? So if you're really high in dynamism and low on sociableness, then that becomes something that you want to pay attention to, and vice versa. And so if you're not sure, right, just take the people in your life and kind of ask them, right? Like ask them about your dynamism, ask them about your sociableness, start to find out where your gaps may be, and then be prepared to kind of turn up or turn down certain elements or areas as you go throughout your daily life. So with that, that kind of wraps us up on our overview of the intersection between persuasion and professional communication. Hopefully you find that information helpful and you get to put it to use right now here today in anything that you're going forward doing.